Welcome. This video guide is intended for U.S. expatriates who will be moving to Israel for work. While this video can serve as a guide, it will not address all the cultural elements you will encounter in Israel. Moving to a new culture for work will present many challenges in your day-to-day life, but we hope to provide some context to the Israeli work environment to get you started. Transitioning to be an expat will require you to learn to laugh at some of the bumps along the way. It's all part of the adventure. Israel has a complex culture with a complex history. When entering a new culture, it can be easy to think in terms of stereotypes or a list of do's and don'ts. Instead, we believe it will be more helpful for you to think of culture using a metaphor. As you learn about Israeli culture, consider the Israeli kibbutz as a metaphor. Kibbutz is a communal settlement unique to Israel. It is a community, historically agrarian, where individuals work together, each individual having a job and all sharing in property and proceeds. The kibbutz theme is a good metaphor as it shows the Israeli egalitarian spirit as well as their love for their torn land. Israel is ever changing as they work through their torn culture, particularly with the newer generation. But it is important to understand where Israel came from and where it is striving to go. Understanding the differences in Israeli and US cultures will be an important stepping stone, allowing you to accept and adapt to the new culture you are working in, making you more effective in your position. In this video, you'll follow along with us as we go through Stephanie's workday. Stephanie is an American expatriate working in Tel Aviv. She recently moved to Israel from the United States and is in a managerial position at a mid-sized tech company. She'll help guide you through some of the cultural differences you're likely to encounter while working in Israel. In this guide, we will be discussing these differences based on several cultural values and scales, including Hofstede's cultural values and Aaron Meyer's culture map scales. We also use the book Understanding Global Cultures by Martin J. Gannon and Rajnandini Pillai. If you want to learn even more, all of our resources will be linked at the end. Without further ado, let's get started on our day with Stephanie.
It's 8 a.m. in Tel Aviv, and Stephanie is leaving her apartment to head into work. Stopped at a red light, Stephanie doesn't turn right, even when there is an opening. The car behind Stephanie blares its horn. Stephanie hasn't adjusted to how aggressive the driving is here in Tel Aviv. The red light has gone to yellow, but not green yet, and already a car is moving up the right side of the shoulder to be the first off the line. Stephanie is having to learn how to take what is thrown at her as well as be assertive in her own driving. Tel Aviv seems more aggressive anyway because of all the soldiers with intense guns standing on the side of the road. Are these soldiers even out of high school? Today is Thursday, the end of Stephanie's first week on the job. Although everyone in the office, even the executives, were dressed pretty casually, Stephanie felt she needed to establish her authority as an outsider. So she has continued to wear her professional clothes the whole week. As Stephanie settles into the office, she closes the door so she can concentrate on working on a training presentation for her team. One of her coworkers pops her head in and asks a question. Stephanie is taken aback as the coworker comes in without knocking and immediately launches into a question. Stephanie answers her question and then asks, "How are you?" Internally, Stephanie thinks, man, no respect for the closed door. What the hell are you doing just walking in? Hope she doesn't stay too long. I need to finish this presentation. Esther, her coworker, takes a seat and responds, well, it hasn't been easy for me this week. My family in the West Bank is trying to get visas to come here, but the government isn't allowing any more visas currently.
So let's unpack some takeaways from Stephanie's experience. First, Stephanie was uncomfortable with the soldiers and their guns on the streets. Don't be surprised when you arrive in Israel and there are soldiers everywhere. Israeli military service is mandatory for men and women right out of high school. And seeing soldiers on the street isn't an indication that something is going wrong. There's no need to try to avoid them. They're there to protect you. Next, Stephanie is eager to establish her position among her employees and colleagues. It's important to remember that Israel's culture has a smaller power distance between individuals than the US does. A small power distance means that Israel is more egalitarian between employees and managers. Workplaces are informal, and colleagues will casually stop by offices and dress informally. Respect isn't given because of titles and position, but rather by proving your hands-on expertise. This is a dynamic you will see in several different situations throughout this presentation, as it is an important difference between US and Israeli cultures and can show up often in the office. Stephanie was trying to be polite when asking how Esther was. In the United States, we are fans of small talk. And when Americans talk small talk, we want it light. However, in Israel, small talk is deeper. If you ask, "How are you?" as a superficial greeting, people in Israel will interpret that as a genuine question and will share deeper and more personal aspects of their lives. In addition, conversations about politics are common and loud. Passionate conversations are just another part of Israel's culture.
So let's get back to Stephanie's day. Stephanie is scheduled for a 10:30 team meeting where she is set to give a training presentation. She arrives at the conference room and is pleased to see everyone is punctual. She is eager to introduce herself to the team as she hasn't met most of the people in the room. Hi, I'm Stephanie, the new product director. As people introduce themselves to her, Stephanie notices that she is the only one who shared her title. She finds herself wondering, is this young guy an intern or one of our senior engineers? She knows the roles of the people she immediately oversees, but has no idea about the rest of the team. Despite having provided this training many times, Stephanie is feeling unsettled by not knowing the roles of those in the room. As she starts on the presentation, she begins to notice just how casual everyone's body language is. Stephanie assumes that all these aspects are why the Israel team has been struggling to keep up with the implementation schedule on the project. She'll have to consider how to address these issues with the team. Since this is a training presentation, she decided to give some impromptu feedback. Stephanie began by telling the team what was going right with the implementation and thanks them for all of their hard work. She then discusses the areas they need to improve and makes several expectations very clear to them. Stephanie also addresses the task-related issues that have held up many of the implementation deliverables. Stephanie feels the mood shift for the better as she gives the team feedback. They all seem eager and ready to make the changes needed.
Let's take a closer look at Stephanie's meeting. Are all the players in the room understanding the interactions the same as Stephanie? Not really. First, although not everyone in the US introduces themselves with their title, they're likely to introduce themselves with what role they play in the team. Stephanie is uncomfortable when she doesn't understand what everyone's relation is to each other. In Israel, however, being on a first name basis is the norm rather than more formal addresses. And Israelis don't define themselves by their title and what they do in the same way as Americans often do. Next, Israelis are punctual. You might interpret this to mean that they are very linear about time, like the US is. However, Israelis have a much more flexible sense of time who take work-life balance very seriously. If it's nice out one day, they might call out of work and head out to the beach. No guilt. This can seem like a contradiction. Israelis work hard, but also take the time to relax and enjoy life. And the last thing to pull out of this meeting is how Stephanie gave negative feedback to the team. Stephanie had been taught to sandwich negative feedback between positive feedback. This won't be an effective strategy in Israel. Although Stephanie interpreted the team as being willing to make the changes, the team actually heard Stephanie's feedback as really positive. In Israel, negative feedback is given directly and bluntly. This can be pretty uncomfortable for an American. However, remember that even though you might interpret blunt negative feedback as rude or hurtful, Israelis don't.
Back in the meeting, Stephanie brings up the next item on the agenda, a project that has been led out by Rachel. Stephanie lays what deliverables will be needed and asks Rachel to keep her updated. Stephanie is surprised when Rachel responds by sharing a lengthy opinion on the deliverables, concluding that she doesn't believe some of the deliverables are needed. Stephanie reiterates that these deliverables will allow her to track the progress of the project and that Rachel should complete them. She further notes that if Rachel has any questions about them, she and Rachel can discuss them later. Rachel continues to justify her stance, going on talking about it for much longer than Stephanie wants in a time-limited team meeting. Rachel is also talking loudly and with her hands. The whole interaction feels like insubordination to Stephanie. Stephanie, feeling slightly less confident, starts with niceties, saying how much she appreciates Rachel's suggestions, but indirectly states that the deliverables have already been decided on.
In this interaction, you can see that as a result of low power distance in Israel, Israelis tend to understand requests from their managers as recommendations. Rachel is also negotiating these recommendations. This can be unusual practice for Americans, especially in the form Israelis use. Although this seems insubordinate, Rachel is likely to see this as a discussion with no disrespect implied. In fact, Rachel would expect her manager to take her opinion into consideration and to negotiate back based on the ideas. Stephanie, however, shuts down the discussion because she's not familiar with these cultural practices. Stephanie will be much more effective in her position with the team if she would be more open to adapting to this negotiation practice. Also in this interaction, Stephanie tried to give a hint to Rachel that she shouldn't argue back. Stephanie forgot that they come from different cultural backgrounds and that Rachel might not be picking up on this meaning. In fact, even more than in the US, Israel has a high context culture. This means that they have more shared experience, and much of the communication can be implicit. It's possible that you could come across as condescending if you try to make things too explicit. US meeting practice is to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. This is because we are a low context culture. In high context cultures, this practice is inappropriate. As Stephanie continues her time here, she will look for what the explicit communication practices are so that she can be better at adapting to them. And lastly, don't be too alarmed when coworkers and employees speak quite loudly, with lots of hand gestures and with little regard to niceties. Israelis are incredibly brash communicators, but they are warm and welcoming people nonetheless.
At the end of Stephanie's day, she's eager to start her weekend. A work week from Sunday to Thursday was another adjustment for her. As she leaves the office, her supervisor asks if she wants to go have a coffee in the open air market close by, and Stephanie happily accepts. As Stephanie and her supervisor walk up and down the aisles of the market, they take their time to sample sweets. Stephanie finds some fruit that is particularly appealing and asks how much. The seller gives her a price and Stephanie begins to negotiate. One thing Stephanie knew before coming to Israel was things like this was up for negotiation. Not just here at the market, but everywhere. Stephanie has learned to enjoy practicing her negotiation skills. After enjoying her coffee with her supervisor and purchasing the fruit, Stephanie heads home. On the way, she decides to make a stop at a new friend's apartment to share her delicious market purchases.
Thank you for walking with us through Stephanie's day. Hopefully you saw some interactions that will get you thinking about how to navigate Israeli culture. We haven't discussed every cultural difference you will encounter, but we hope this helps you begin to think about some of the differences that you might encounter in the workplace while working in Israel. As you continue your expatriate training, look for metaphors that will help you understand the beautiful and rich Israeli culture, and keep the kibbutz in mind. Thank you.